Up until now this season, I've been fishing the Dorset Stour mostly around Throop and a few other stretches as well, catching lots and lots of roach, probably far more than I've normally had by this time of the season. This time last season I'd had less than 100 total. This year that's more like 400, and that's promising because there's a lot of small roach around. They're not particularly big, fish around about this size, but the odd much better ones, uh, 8 ounces, 12 ounces and some over a pound. So that's quite a nice start. But for a change this week, despite some alterations to my plans, I was supposed to go and fish a nice estate lake in Wiltshire, and that got cried off at the last minute. But hopefully the next few weeks I can get up there and do some fishing. I thought I'd go and fish the Hampshire Avon. One of the most famous fisheries on the Hampshire Avon is the Royalty fishery, and it's been a fishery for hundreds and hundreds of years. The clue's in the name, royalty. That's because the king at some point separated the fishing rights from the land and awarded them to whoever the first owners were, and this happened quite a bit locally in Hampshire and Dorset. Christchurch was always in Hampshire, and in Dorset at places like Longham and at Wareham on the Piddle and the Froome. Similar fisheries were separated from the land, and also at Ringwood the Several fishery, not Severals. Severals doesn't mean anything at all. It's called the Several fishery, and we've got the Royalty fishery at Christchurch, but there's also a Royalty fishery at Wareham on the Piddle and a Royalty fishery at Longham on the Dorset Stour. And it was the salmon fishing rights that really mattered. It was nothing to do with dace and roach and chub and barbel. There weren't chub and barbel in these rivers, almost certainly way back in those days. Certainly barbel are quite recent, and I suspect chub aren't that older transfer to the Stour and Avon. So the Royalty fishery, as we know it for modern angling, has certainly been well known for its barbel since the 1930s. It's chub fishing, fantastic roach fishing going back well over 100 years ago, when I believe there was a slaughterhouse on the river, so all the guts, the waste went into the river and grew massive roach. And even in the 1970s and 80s, certain parts of the Royalty were famed for their roach fishing, like the famous Cinder Path, which is above the Great Weir, and that then goes on to the lower end of Christchurch Angling Club water, known as Lower Winkton, not very far up there. But there are definitely roach throughout the Royalty fishery. I've fished the Royalty a few times. I've never been a great regular on there, but over the last couple of decades, both Christchurch and Ringwood clubs have had concessions to be able to fish on there one way or the other, and currently it's Ringwood Club that enables me to pick up a ticket from Davis Tackle in the morning and go onto the water. So I thought I'd see if I could get a couple of hours on the Royalty and see if I could catch a roach out of the Avon on that stretch. Previously, like I say, I've caught some roach on there, nothing very big, small ones up to half a dozen, maybe the biggest 9 or 10 ounces, that's all. Every year some much bigger ones come out, probably 2-pounders, certainly plenty over a pound. They are in little pockets, they're not throughout. You tend not to be able to set up on a swim there and just pull out 20 pounds of average sized roach. The day I chose was Friday the 13th, which is regarded as an unlucky day. And you could say things didn't get off to a great start. I took some advice and headed for Barlins, which is down below Christchurch bypass, where the river splits into two and goes through the two channels that then join up again down towards Claypool. And what I hadn't checked was that the tide was right out, so the water was very low. And I also didn't realise that it's a bit of an assault course to get past out of the field below the main car park on the Royalty. When you get to the bottom of it, you've got the bypass, and you've got to get over a stile, underneath the bypass, on a path that's got a railing there, quite narrow, up the other side. And I wanted to cross the river, so I crossed on the road bridge. And you don't want to try and cross the Christchurch bypass on the actual road. It's extremely busy, certainly was at the time I was there. And then you've got to get down the other bank, through another fence that was pretty bad, and then walk down the field. And that's what I did. And I followed the river down. Like I say, the tide was right out. It was very low and shallow. And when I got to the run where I wanted to fish, it was a couple of feet deep, fairly pacey. And the bait I'd chosen to take was hempen tears, and with it pacey and like that, I must admit my heart sank. I didn't fancy it for roach at all. I think with a different tide, maybe a different bait, I might have stood a chance of catching roach there. But I fed hemp for a little while, 15-20 minutes, didn't get any bites. I didn't see that hemp was going to draw anything up much in a swim like that. The roach are down there somewhere. They're tucked away under the trees, hiding somewhere. So I quickly abandoned that, made my way back up through, fought my way through the fences and bridge and everything else, emerged at the other side just above the bypass, which looked more promising. I started to catch weed quite a lot, found it quite tricky. I think if I'd persevered, I probably would have been okay. Still, the tide was out, and I was lacking confidence, and time was ebbing away. I didn't want to be out very long, and I wanted to catch I still haven't caught a fish. It's one of those days we're now nearly an hour into a short session, nothing doing. Just below the main car park, there's a corner where a tiny little stream runs off and eventually emerges down in Christchurch. And in that corner there's cabbages, lily pads, and the underwater cabbages, which are sort of all crinkled up lily pads underwater. And the current comes in and it sort of boils across it and comes back on itself. There's all sorts of debris floating around, bits of weed. And there were little fish topping, little chub and little dace, nothing very big. And I looked down amongst the cabbages, I saw a little roach like that. So I thought, well, there's fish there. I did fish it about 10 years ago, possibly with casters. And I remember catching 3 or 4 roach, getting a lot of trouble with pike, which were waiting for just about every fish I hooked or put back. But I thought, well, here's a chance. Had fished a waggler down further down, and with the complex currents going, decided a top and bottom float would be much better. So I set up a stick float and started to fish, only about a 5 number 4 stick float. And I started to get some quite tentative bites, really little dinks. And the tail was coming back, like the side had been chewed a bit, just sort of nibbled at. And I think that was these little tiny chub and dace and stuff like that. No real bites to hit. It wasn't really going under, it was just dinking 1/4 of an inch, nothing. So I persevered for a while, and wasn't that long. I only got a proper bite, and you can see what happened now. And this was the sort of fish I was looking for. And this one fish has made my day, really. I've gone to the Royalty to catch a roach, and I've caught a roach, which was nice. After that, I stuck at it for a while longer. The wind was getting up, it was blowing into the bank, which wasn't too helpful. I did pick up a little dace and a couple of little chub. And I had to make a decision whether I went and found a more favourable swim, which I probably could have done, or called it a day. And I decided it was one of those funny mornings, it wasn't going that well, and left it at that. One thing that did happen not long after I caught the roach is the Mitchell match I was using. There's a locking nut that holds down the baffle plate when you take the spool off, there's a aluminium plate there, baffle plate, held on by a nut with a very shallow thread, and that nut had come loose without a means to tighten it up. One good thing about having reels that are interchangeable, more than one of the same reel, could just take the spool off, put the other reel on, switch it, carry on fishing. So that was all right. And when I got home, I could tighten that nut up, and that was fine. I hope you've enjoyed this very brief look at the royalty. I do want to go back. People have mentioned some areas for some better roach. I need to have another look. The royalty wasn't particularly busy. There were a few people around. When I got there, there were only 3 other cars in the main car park. There is another car park further up. And by the time I left there around about 11 o'clock, there were maybe 6 or 7 cars. And I'm going to leave you looking at this old Angling Times article, which is pretty much exactly 50 years old. It's August the 12th, 1971. And it shows the anglers are shoulder to shoulder on the royalty, and that's what it was like in the old days. Very prolific for fish. Lots of these anglers weren't catching anything much, but some of them were doing very well, catching clonking great roach, big chub, a big perch, barbel. And they used to say back in the day, and it was a bit of a free-for-all, that if you landed a good fish and turned your back and laid the fish on the bank and went for your scales and weighed your fish and put it back, and you turn around, there'll be someone in your swim. I wouldn't be surprised if there were a few punch-ups back in the day, or people would be ledgering not very far out, and next thing they'd find someone wading. Hey mate, you're stood on my lead, and stuff like that. Happy days. I will go back to the royalty, try spend a lot more time there and elsewhere on the Avon as well. That's it for now. See you again soon.